The classic Saab 900 is perhaps Saab's most iconic car. And while in true Saab fashion, it had quite a few quirks, some of which would even make Doug DeMuro excited. In this video, we'll be discussing 9 big quirks that this car has, and I want to kick it off by discussing probably the biggest, which is the whole setup under the hood. Now you open up the hood and you can see it is a sort of a clamshell hood as opposed to a traditional rear latching hood. What we have going on under here at first glance might not look too out of the ordinary until you start to get closer into it. First off, as you might notice, the cylinder head of the engine is at a 45-degree angle. It is not sitting upright as you would see in, well, every other car I have ever seen on the road. It is actually at a 45-degree angle, and part of the reason for that is the transmission is actually mounted underneath the engine. So the front of the engine is technically back here. This is where you have all of your belts and pulleys and things like that. The output of the engine is then on this end under all of this fun stuff. It is sent into this silver fun piece right here, which is essentially a set of chains and gears that are then sent down to the bottom here and then into the transmission, and power is of course sent through the front wheels. Despite the engine facing this direction, it is not a rear-wheel drive car. It is still front-wheel drive, and that definitely has its perks and it has its downsides. But overall, I pop the hood of this car at car meets and people are just so confused by what is going on under here. For this second quirk, we need to hop inside and talk about one of the safety features that this car has, which is both where the key is located as well as what is called the reverse lockout. So with the key not in the car, first off, the key is placed down here as opposed to on the steering column up here. Anyone that's watching this that is familiar with Saab would probably know that. Pretty much every modern Saab is like this, but you cannot get the transmission out of reverse without the key in. I need to put the key in order to pop it out of reverse and put it in any other gear. So it's a little goofy, but it does help to make sure it's always parked in gear and ideally prevents theft. And while I'm sitting in here, let's discuss one of my favorite quirks, and it's one of my favorite quirks because I see it every time I drive the car, and that is just this little econ indicator on the tachometer. You can see from about maybe 1200 RPM up to 3500 is green in the rev range, and it is labeled as econ, essentially meaning if you keep the car in this rev range, it's going to be the most efficient. That kind of goes without saying, but it's just funny that they put it in there and adds a nice little flair to the instrument cluster. Before we jump into the rest of these, if you like Saabs, you like my channel, feel free to hit the like button and the subscribe button, as well as check out my merchandise, which I have linked in the top of the description. Help show your Saab swag and support this dead brand that unfortunately no longer exists. How often do you see a rubber spoiler on a car? In basically every case, when a car has a rear spoiler, it's sometimes meant for style, of course, but it generally is intended to provide downforce for better grip. And that means it essentially needs to be a stiff, either metal, carbon fiber, or some sort of stiff material to allow it to be firm and provide that downforce. And well, I don't know if I've ever seen another car that has a rubber rear spoiler back here, but it really does add to the look of this rear end. Super cool. And it also has a couple little drains because when it rains, water collects in this area right here. Sticking to the exterior of the car, this fifth quirk is kind of the combination of a couple things, which is just the signage on the car. You might know, and because this is a turbo, it says it in about 100 different places. Of course, you have the 900 turbo in the rear. That's pretty typical, but you also have it written on the corners of the hood in both places. It's on the grille right here, and in some cases I've even seen it written on the interior in a couple places, although my car does not have that. And on top of that, another goofy little sign or badge that's on the outside of the car is right here where it says unleaded fuel only. And you think usually that is put in the gauge cluster by the gas tank, or maybe on the inside here But Saab just decided to put a sticker right there on the outside next to the fuel door. Number 6 is more of a generalization. It's just the overall shape of this car. I mean, how often do you see a 3-door hatchback, especially one that is shaped like this? Some other exterior styling features that I find a bit odd, as we already discussed, the clamshell hood. We also have these interesting roof drains here. So, you know, some cars will have these plastic guards put over the top of the windows to help keep rain out. This car actually has them on both sides of the roof, and the rain just kind of feeds down into this channel and down the back of the car. And that leads me to our next point here, which are these little vents just kind of randomly placed seemingly on the rear quarter panel. They are functional and they do help break up what would otherwise be a pretty plain panel, but it's just interesting to have these here, and also pretty cool that they're functional. This was well before the time of fake vents. Let's hop back inside for our 7th quirk, which are automatic seat belts. This was sort of a safety feature that was implemented kind of before airbags as a passive restraint. The seatbelt generally sits in this position right here, and it's actually a 2-piece seatbelt. The first piece, when the door opens, comes up here and then down along the front of the roof and sits right here. And this essentially allows you to get out without actually unbuckling the seatbelt. Then when you close the door, it slides back and down. The second part of the seatbelt is actually just a lap belt that comes across here and plugs in there. So mine actually do not work, or they worked very temporarily before sporadically not working. So I actually pulled all the relays for them, but I will put in a clip here of how they do work in function. Open the door, seatbelts open up. We hop on in here. Look at that. That's so cool. And when I'm ready to get out, open the door and it comes back up for me, so it's nice and easy to get out. Our second to last quirk, number 8, is a little bit goofy and small, but it's something I kind of appreciate. And it's actually this rear parcel shelf right here. So obviously a lot of wagons and hatchbacks have these sort of parcel shelves to kind of hide the view of whatever you have in the trunk. In this case, I have a couple spare belts. It's just a painted piece of plywood, and I've actually seen a lot of them that aren't even painted, which is really goofy. So it's kind of like they spent the time and the effort to carpet the top, but not the bottom. A lot of more modern cars just have some sort of plastic cheap cover, but this is, you know, the finest plywood that you could get in Sweden, I'm sure. And our last quirk is kind of a bit of a cheat because my car does not technically have it, but I feel like it needs to be included. And those are headlight washers. I know a lot of Saabs from the 80s, 90s, and even into the early 2000s with the early 9.5s and OG 9.3s had headlight wipers, which essentially came out through this little hole in the bumper and then went across the front and kind of wiped the headlight with the press of a button. So there you have it. That is 9 quirky features of the classic Saab 900. I feel like it's been a long time since I've done one of these. It kind of harks back to my original videos when I did one of these with my original 9.3. I'll link that video in the top corner if you want to see a super old video on the channel. But with that said, thank you all so much for watching. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Check out my Patreon and my merch if you're interested in helping support the channel more. Subscribe if you haven't already and help me reach 100,000. I think that's all the self-promotion I gotta do. So I'll see y'all next time.